Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's panel. We're going to be discussing one of the most promising but perhaps enigmatic subjects in sustainable finance globally today. This is the EU's renewed sustainable finance strategy and some of the emerging collaborations between public and private actors that are needed to make it happen. This is a topic that's very close to my heart. My role is head of EU and UK policy with the Principles for Responsible Investment. And I'm joined by currently 2, hopefully 3 panelists, each of whom will bring a unique perspective on the issue. We are expecting to be joined fairly soon by Martin Spolch, who's head of Sustainable Finance and FinTech within the European Commission. For those of you who are not in the deep end of EU policy, Martin's team are in the civil service of Europe, so they're responsible for the policy design. And we're hoping that Martin will be able to join and give us the latest insight on the strategy. We're also joined by 2 finance industry experts. We have Brenda Kramer, who's a senior advisor with Dutch pension giant PGGM, and she's been a key part of some of the existing and upcoming public and private collaborations, so very keen to hear her perspective. And Judson Barkley is Managing Director, Sustainability Strategy and Regulatory Affairs with UBS and a well-established commentator and expert in this field, so I'm really delighted to have both of their participation. Before we kick off, we will be having time for Q&A at the end, so I would encourage you to enter your questions or comments in the chat box, and we're very keen to have an interactive dialogue with the audience. But with that in mind, I'd like to start by coming to Brenda. Brenda, what are you hoping for from the renewed sustainable finance strategy? And I'm hoping you can also give us just a little bit of grounding in the background of the strategy.
Yes, of course. Thank you, and welcome to all. Thank you for joining today. Maybe just start with the background. I've been part of the technical expert group that the European Commission started about 2.5 years ago. And the reason for that technical expert group was actually the first sustainable finance strategy and the action plan on sustainable finance. And that action plan basically boiled down to 3 main objectives, which is moving capital from non-sustainable to sustainable activities. It's making ESG integration basically mainstream. And it had to make sure that data get more transparent. So actually, if you sell something that's sustainable, it should be sustainable. And so these 10 actions that the plan had were really focused on that. And part of that was a new obligation on financial institutions in the EU to disclose all of this information. So how do you integrate ESG? How do you deal with climate risk? What do you do on impacts? How are your policies designed? How do you inform your clients on what you do on sustainability? So all of these questions you basically have to answer from next year if you're a financial institution within the European Union. Then on top of that, basically to kind of build on this objective to move capital from unsustainable or less sustainable activities to sustainable activities, the Commission suggested to design a taxonomy. Now, I think when I started, nobody really knew what a taxonomy was. It's a biological term, which is basically putting the layers of a certain species into context. And so when we introduced the term taxonomy in the financial world, that was not really something that appealed directly. But I would say by now it's one of the most used new buzzwords, especially within the European Union. And so the objective of this taxonomy was really to define, okay, if we want to move capital from one place to another, where should we move it to? So how can we define together where this capital actually has to go? What can we call environmentally sustainable? And that's what this European taxonomy is all about. And because as a group back then, we decided we didn't want to list just, windmills, solar cells, and electrical cars, because by then everybody knew that was quite a kind of okay. And so we took the perspective of, where can you, if you look at climate mitigation, where are the biggest gains to, if it comes to CO2 emissions? And that's the reason why we also included sectors like cement and steel, and we're going to include air transport, maritime transport, because these sectors have a fundamental role in our society. They're not yet sustainable, but we want them to move to a more sustainable path. So that's in a nutshell what the taxonomy is about. And I think the new strategy will build on this further, like extending the definitions of sustainable, specifying more what sectors have to do, so certain transition pathways for specific sectors, because the movement that you can start in a certain sector depends a lot on how much capex is needed to incentivize changes, how is the sector built, how elastic is the sector. So that's all things that you need to take. So what I'm hoping for is that, first of all, the Commission in the new strategy will prioritize the development of meaningful data, because that's also the taxonomy only works if you can actually you actually have data on how far you're away from the threshold or a certain reference point in the taxonomy. Secondly, I hope, as I just said, that they will really choose to guide the transition. So by defining sector pathways, much more focused on real economy pathways, extending the emission trading system. So really putting a price on externalities, which actually has a direct effect on the real economy and helps financial institutions to better price their risk-return ratios, basically. And I also hope. Hi, Martin.
Hi, Martin. Welcome. No problem, Martin. We're just having some comments from Brenda and Judson, and then we'll come to you for your set piece. Brenda, would you like to continue?
Yes. So just a quick recap. So I hope the new strategy will prioritize the development of meaningful data. Secondly, guide transition. Um, Thirdly, include a social perspective much more than we've done until now, because I think, especially in the current crisis, we see how important it is to look at the social aspects. And on a more personal note, but if I looked at the documentary last weekend from Sir David Attenborough, his newest film, and actually he says there as well, and I've read it many times, but now it came to me again, was that, by educating children, like poorer people, children, girls in particular, we can actually also have a big influence on climate change, because it provenly reduced reproduction rates, which sounds not really loving, but that's so. I think that is an aspect that we haven't really looked at until now, but I feel that within this crisis that we're in is definitely something that will have a more prominent space in the new strategy. And then fourthly, and I think Judson will say something about that as well, is the absolute importance for global conversions.
Fantastic. Judson, I wonder if I could come to you next.
Yeah, I think I'm going to keep it short. I have much more to say, but yeah.
Thank you. I think we had a few audio problems.
I'm sorry, would you like me to jump in there? Maybe I'll just offer a few words in advance of Martin sort of giving us the content of what he's going to drive out in the strategy. But let me just say a few words on how we a little bit think about the strategy right now. And I guess ultimately, my punchline would be, what I would love to see out of the renewed sustainable finance strategy is for it actually to be the renewed sustainable economy strategy. And it's really just one word, but essentially it's meant to convey the idea that this really needs to be a whole economy transition. If you look at the IEA's new net zero emission scenario that came out this week, you're talking about going from less than 40% low carbon emission electricity generation to upwards of 70% by 2030. Talking about going from 2.5% electric vehicles to 40% by 2030. What we really need, building on what Brenda said, are these real economy transition pathways that guide the real economy sectors in terms of what they need to do. We in the finance sector absolutely have every desire to be part of this transition, but the reality is at the end of the day, we don't manufacture cars, we don't produce cement, we don't build power plants. We can finance those things, we can support our clients in their transitions to those things, but it needs to be part of their corporate strategies. So they really need the policy and the economic signals that essentially show them and tell them that that is the future where they need to drive to. And then we will absolutely be there to support their transitions. So a lot of good regulations that have been in place, and certainly compliment Europe and the European Commission for really raising the whole profile around sustainable finance. But in some sense, yeah, I would like to see this transition from a sustainable finance discussion to a sustainable economy discussion. Just to give another point on that, here in Switzerland, our parliament has just passed a revised CO2 Act, and it is a whole economy transition piece of law. It lays down guidelines for the building sector, for the transport sector, for the industrial sector, yes, for the finance sector too, and certainly directives to our regulators to do climate risk analysis in the financial sector. But it is an integrated strategy across all aspects of the economy, essentially trying to align all of our activities. The finance will align with the real economy shifts in production, but we need to do this as a very whole economy joined up effort.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Judson. Martin, I'm going to come to you first. Oh, you next, I'm sorry. So we'd love you to give us an update on the strategy and the recently launched platform on sustainable finance, but also if you'd like to respond to the points that Brenda and Judson have been raising around international harmonization and around the need for integration with the real economy, please do go ahead.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you perfectly.
Excellent. How much time do you give me?
Let's start with 5 minutes and see how we get on.
Okay, and we are already on air, or?
We are already on air.
Excellent. So let me first thank you very much for inviting me to this session. I would like to start by saying that where we are now, is a very special moment because we are now really concluding all the actions of the existing action plan on sustainable finance. And we are also living in a different context. The context is that we are now having a European Green Deal, and we are also living in a recovery context. And it's very clear that all the work that HLEG has done and was excellent, and also the European Commission's action plan, is no longer sufficient for this context and for the challenges that we are seeing. So we are now turning the page and we are entering a new chapter in sustainable finance. As you have seen, we launched a very comprehensive consultation on the renewed sustainable finance strategy. There was a massive feedback. We received more than 650 responses. And the feedback suggests that we really need to increase the ambition and shift the gear to a higher pace and to really bring sustainable finance to the next level. Many respondents argued that obviously so far we have focused on the disclosure and we have asked those who would like to make a positive contribution to be transparent about how they have reached conclusion that they are making a positive contribution. But many respondents argued that this transparency or focus on transparency and disclosure only is a very important and necessary step, but it's simply not a sufficient step. So maybe I will tell you now a little bit more about the 6 themes that we have identified coming from the consultation responses. I cannot tell you today what the Commission will do because that's obviously for my new Commissioner, Maggie Guinness, who started her job yesterday. But I will tell you about six themes that stakeholders identified as major themes that the Commission needs to follow up on. The first one is that we should shift the mindset from greening finance to finance green and finance sustainability more broadly. I think that this is going in the direction of the previous intervention, how to make sure that the whole economy is sustainable, not only the financial sector, but how the financial sector can be part of the solution and can support the businesses and the economy on their transition pathways to meeting all these ambitious goals. So this is something that we have really put very high on the list. We also have received comments that so far our agenda has been focusing on expanding the green and mobilize capital towards sustainable investment so that the big investment gap that we had is filled. But there are also stakeholders who argue you cannot really focus only on the transition towards dark green and towards sustainability. You also need to facilitate transition of those who are currently environmentally harmful or making an environmental negative impact, and to move them, on the spectrum towards less harmful impact. And the stakeholders argue that this is a missing piece in our strategy. We don't have taxonomy for those issues. Obviously, our primary objective is to steer as much sustainable investment, into dark green. But there are stakeholders who argue that we need to elaborate a little bit more on this transitional aspect and how to move, those who are really now creating a lot of environmental harm. The second issue that has popped up very, very strongly, and we are already working on, is that this agenda on sustainable finance is not only relevant for the private sector, but it's also very important to align the tools and frameworks to the extent possible with the public sector. And you have seen certainly, the announcement by the president in September, where we are now considering how to apply taxonomy and the green bonds in the public context. The Commission committed to these issues already in January, and consultation feedback suggested that we need to advance much more. The third issue, I think that is coming up very clearly, is that so far we have focused on all three aspects of ESG, but we have prioritized climate, we have prioritized environmental objectives, but stakeholders argued that we really need to have a more comprehensive and holistic approach to sustainability. And they do argue that we need to work much harder on social and governance aspects. Obviously, social, it's very relevant in the current recovery context, and the governance aspect also come up very clearly. And the Commission there already committed to propose a legislative proposal on corporate governance and how to mainstream sustainability in corporate governance next year. The fourth issue, where we have been not criticized, but I think that stakeholders were rather blunt with us, that we have not done enough, and not only us, but in general, stakeholders have not done enough on promoting a long-term horizon not only in our policies, but also in the way how businesses and financial sector operate. This is the agenda of long-termism that the high-level expert group tabled back in January 2018. And stakeholders argue that we cannot make this agenda success without really thinking harder whether the regulatory and policy frameworks are actually promoting long-termism and long-term horizon in the decision-making processes. The fifth issue I would like to say is that stakeholders in the recovery context argued, again, I cannot generalize, but there have been many responses arguing that so far our approach has been focusing on risks of individual institutions and how these individual institutions are coping with those risks. But many suggested that we need to have tools and frameworks to manage and monitor and reduce the impact of the possible crisis and the interactions of the different challenges together, so that we focus on the resilience of the overall system more broadly, not only resilience of individual institutions. And here, stakeholders argued that this is not relevant only for climate change, but for environmental degradation more broadly, the loss of biodiversity, and the importance of articulating the interaction of those challenges and risks, which can, again, be very, very brutal and very violent. Finally, maybe 2 points still. One is that stakeholders argued that it's very good that the Commission and the EU now has very clear targets when it comes to climate neutrality in 2050 and the increased targets for 2030. They welcome this clarity on the pathway, at least, what is the goal. But they argue that we need to be much clearer what it means concretely for translating those goals into concrete actions in between, let's say now and 2030 and 2050. What needs to happen between these milestones? And stakeholders argue that we need to bring more clarity on the transitional pathways and work with stakeholders how they can make not only an incremental progress towards meeting these targets, but really substantial progress, so that at the end of the mandate of this Commission, which is 2024, we would better understand where the financial sector stands, and that we can say that there has been a major progress and that the financial sector is now financing not a scenario of 4 degrees, but let's say 3.5 at least. So that this is something that has come up also quite strongly from some stakeholders. And finally, this is my final point, and sorry, I'm exceeding my limit. The stakeholders also suggested that it's very welcome that the Commission established the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, and it's a very positive initiative, which, by the way, we are celebrating one year anniversary this Friday. But they did argue that we need to take it to the next step now. We need to not only map who has done what, but really identify how the different standards and and frameworks, including taxonomy, green bond standards, disclosure requirements, can converge at a global level. And the International Platform on Sustainable Finance obviously plays an important role, but here we cover, I mean, it's already good. We cover half of global GDP, jurisdictions covering half of global GDP, half of global population and global emissions, but that's simply not good enough. So we need to think harder again what we can do at a global level and how we can ensure a little bit more multilateral approach to climate change and environmental degradation. Final point from me on this point, many stakeholders also argue that this agenda, even if it is very successful in the European Union, when it comes to climate, we will address just 9 or 10% of global emissions, and that they encouraged us to think harder and invent our agenda on how this agenda can be relevant for emerging markets and developing countries in particular, because these are those who will get the hardest hit, and these are those countries who will, and places in the world that will be most affected, not only by climate change, but all the other challenges and environmental degradation issues. So there have been some proposals and suggestions, how this agenda should focus more on the developing countries and emerging markets, especially in the current recovery context, and to make sure that the recovery that they are going through now and that they will of course, hopefully accelerate as much as they can, be as green as possible. Like, in a way, I mean, in the European Union, we are trying to ensure that there is no trade-off between speedy recovery and speedy acceleration of this green transition. So we need to think harder about the global aspect and the global dimension as well. So here, I mean, I would stop, Alisa, and I would leave the floor to the others as well.
Thank you, Martin. One quick question before I come to Brenda and Judson for any reactions to your presentation, but when can we expect the new strategy?
Alisa, can you repeat the question, please?
When can we expect the new strategy?
The announcement was made that we would do it before the end of the year. I cannot now comment on anything more. I mean, obviously now we have a new commissioner and we are going to discuss the exact timing of the adoption of this strategy with her very shortly. I mean, she has, started her new job yesterday, and we will need to discuss basically what is her preference now when it comes to the timing of adoption. So I'm afraid that I cannot be very clear on this today. But once there is a clarity, we will obviously announce it.
No problem. Thank you, Martin. Judson, I wonder if I could come to you. Any reactions, reflections from Martin's comments? You're on mute, Judson. I'm afraid you're still on mute. Now we can hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Let me pick up on that international dimension that Martin mentioned. I think that's something you would probably look to for comment from a global firm like UBS. And I've spent my 20 plus years in the financial sector working on sort of the core financial regulation on various topics. And one of the real benefits that we can see in some of those topics is when things really get moved into the international standard setting processes. So I'm thinking a little bit, some of the things that were developed after the 2008 financial crisis. When the G20 and the FSB took on the challenge of regulating and then unregulated derivatives market, it was one of the keys to that success, I think, was the fact that they could agree on 4 key milestones that they wanted to see achieved, and there was a very coordinated work plan over honestly a period of 10 years now, but to the point that now 10 years later we actually have a well-functioning regulated derivatives market, whereas in 2008 we did not. And so the core things on margining, clearing, trade reporting, essentially that was driven out in a highly coordinated global way. Likewise, with recovery and resolution planning, a completely new topic after the financial crisis. First, it started to diverge. Some countries focusing on completion of data templates, some countries focus on recovery plans, some focus on resolution plans. But the FSB took that on and really coordinated and organized that discussion. The concept of resolution colleges were developed to bring together their supervisors and central banks across countries to work with their institutions that they each essentially had some material interest in, and essentially that now is a fairly well organized and clear set of discussions and requirements for firms. So I certainly applaud the work that's been done to set up some of these new innovative forums, NGFS, international platforms. But I guess I would really hope that some of that work could be taken on board at the level of the G20, the FSBs, the Basel committees, the IOSCOs. I think you've seen the example just recently of the IFRS Foundation sticking its toe in the water in terms of maybe taking forward you're trying to develop standards around non-financial or sustainability reporting. When it gets into those sort of core standard setters, that really has an incredible multiplying and leveraging effect. And so I know it can be a little bit slower at times, but ultimately I think it can be much more effective to drive the discussions there. And I know there's some political issues around that at the moment, but I really would encourage your work to see if we can drive some of these discussions via some of the core standard setters.
Brilliant, thank you, Judson. Brenda, do you have any comments you'd like to make? Any reactions to Martin's points or anything Judson's just said? Brenda, I think we're having a few connection issues.
Same time, yeah.
We can't hear you either.
Yeah.
You're back.
Now you're back. Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, good. Thank you. And I fully agree with Judson on the international aspect. So we won't go deep into that. And I absolutely think that standard setters do play a role in mainstreaming this. However, I think it makes it easier when there is already a good example. So what we see happening is now, actually last week I set up a call with the new Secretary General of the Canadian Finance Platform, and they were really looking to learn from what we've done in Europe. And these economies differ, but if we can kind of put an example of how to set up a taxonomy along a certain methodology, it helps standardization. So I think it's also good to just keep on working and see where the standard setters start picking it up based on the examples that are there now already internationally. On what Martin has said, I think on content, it was pretty much in line with what I said. So I'm quite happy with what I'm hearing. We were one of the stakeholders, so it's not a big surprise, but glad to see that more people actually gave that back to the Commission. I think I would like to highlight 3 more practical things that I think are necessary to really enable the strategy. And that's firstly that was the international. Secondly, it's align the current and future legislative timelines, because what we're in the implementation now looking at is different timelines for different regulations, and it makes it very complicated, not only to implement, but also to explain to our clients what we're doing and by when and how we're ensuring that they are still compliant with everything that's changing in different timelines. So that's definitely a message that I would give along to the Commission. And the second one is also, again, alignment, but then on the content of these initiatives. And by that I mean, how do we align do no significant harm principles with adverse impacts? Because they're very much the same, but it's not very clear for everyone how to diverse. And we've been very deep into that, which makes it graspable, but it should be accessible for anyone that hasn't worked for 2 years on this kind of legislation. So that is, and then again, and that's very much to Judson, also align as much as possible with already existing frameworks like DCFD, like PCAP, like platforms that are already there, because there's a lot of good practices out there in the market that we should definitely use and not do their work again.
Brenda. Martin, I'd like to come back to you in a moment just to give us an update on the platform on sustainable finance. Obviously, this is a new initiative. It's part of the broader push from the European Commission on sustainable finance. I'm very keen to hear just a very quick update from you on what the status of that platform is and what your aspirations are for it. And then it would be remiss of me not to point out that Brenda has been appointed as a member of that platform, and also very keen to hear Brenda's perspective. Before I come to Martin, just a very quick point to the audience. You are still welcome to submit questions. We'll be going into Q&A in a moment. At the moment, we're not getting a very high number, so I'm going to continue with the conversation, but please do use the chat function if you have key questions, and I'll make sure that we get to them. So with that, Martin, if you're able to hear us and to speak, would you like to give us a very quick update on your platform and on the platform and your aspirations for it?
Yes, thank you very much, Alyssa. First of all, I would like to clarify we have 2 platforms. One is the international platform on sustainable finance, where we are having jurisdictions around the world who are willing to promote sustainable finance, not only in their jurisdictions, but to agree on a common denominator. And then we have the European platform, the EU platform on sustainable finance, which is a successor to the technical expert group that helped the Commission over the last 2 years, more than 2 years, developed the first blueprint of the climate taxonomy, the green bond standard, the climate benchmarks, and the climate-related disclosures for corporates. The platform, the new one that will have the first meeting tomorrow and on Friday, will have 50 selected members from not only the financial sector, but also from businesses, NGOs, academia, and also some public institutions and entities that will advise the Commission and provide recommendations on the development of taxonomy, not only beyond climate taxonomy, so i.e. for the other 4 environmental objectives, but also will make sure that the taxonomy works on the ground. They will also work to make sure that taxonomy is usable, it's practical. I mean, it's not creating unnecessary administrative burden, and that taxonomy is being seen in the first place as a useful tool, not again a regulatory burden, which is, I think, very, very important to stress. There is obviously also a mandate for the platform to advise the Commission on possible merits of expanding the scope of taxonomy beyond environmental objectives. This is explicitly required by the taxonomy regulation that the platform will need to look into possible options for expanding the taxonomy to social objectives as well as to taxonomy of activities that are providing significant harm, and by the way also neutral activities. So there is a kind of whole spectrum of economic activities on the table. We are very, very pleased and we're very happy not only with the quality of the applications that we have received, but in particular we are very pleased with the quality of the best experts that we selected. It's a really impressive group. I mean, last week we published the list. We are, of course, very, very thrilled and very happy with the fact that Nathan Fabian, the Chief Responsible Officer at the PRI, has accepted to be the chair of the platform, who, by the way, doesn't enjoy only full trust by the Commission, but he has, I think, all the necessary credentials and experience and qualities, and also a great reputation in the market to run this work. We have on purpose opted for an external chair for this work. Before, the technical expert group was chaired by the Commission. Now we wanted to again enter a new chapter by empowering the private sector more, and that's exactly why Nathan will play a particularly important role. For us, this platform will not only be super important in terms of delivering the content of the work to us, again that we will then process in the Commission, but for us the platform is a very important manifestation of something very important, which is a very strong partnership between the public and private sector in developing this agenda together. We have been very clear that, it would be insane to think that we can create a successful sustainable finance policy agenda only from our own offices here in Berlamo or in our Commission's buildings. We do need to interact very, very strongly and rely on the expertise out there in the market. And, the experiences which we had with the HLAC and the technical expert group has been so outstanding that we are now again entering a new chapter, even deepening this strong partnership with the private sector. I should also say that we had to disappoint many applicants that we had to reject. The platform has only 50 members, but I would like to say that given the outstanding number and the number of outstanding applications, the platform will obviously interact and make an extended outreach with stakeholders throughout the process. So everybody who would like to contribute to make this agenda a success will have the opportunity to do so either via the platform or, of course, directly with our team in the Commission. I think that I will stop here. I mean, the agenda is very, very tight. We will have to basically have the first deliverables of the platform already basically in late spring next year, so that the Commission can proceed to the second stage of adopting the delegated act on the other 4 environmental objectives before the end of next year.
Fantastic. Thank you, Martin. I'd like to invite Brenda and Judson to respond. Brenda as a newly appointed member of the platform, and Judson as someone who's been tracking this agenda very closely over a number of years. Any comments you'd like to make? Perhaps Brenda first. We have around 5 minutes left, and we have one question or maybe two from the audience. So if you could be brief.
Yes, definitely. I think what Martin says about collaboration is something that I absolutely would like to highlight, because what I found in working at Tech, and I'm actually looking forward to in the platform again, is that we work with so many different expertise, and we're actually building this bridge. I see it between science that tells us, what are the big climate scenarios, what do we need to do, and how do we actually make that practicable for the financial sector, for companies, and I think you can only build that bridge if you put together the elements that all have a role to play. There's no one sector that can do this change. And I think that was the power of the tech, and I'm hoping that will be the power of the platform again. So yeah, that would be my comment to that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Brenda. And Judson, any comments you'd like to make at this stage?
No, I think you largely agree with that. I think that fits with some of the things we spoke about earlier on about you really needing to line up the real economy sectors with the financial sector and make sure essentially we're all rowing the same direction. We're all working towards the same targets, and really embedding essentially a new set of constraints into the financial decision making, and those need to be informed, to Brenda's point, by science. Essentially we are operating within a biosphere that has physical constraints that we need to manage within, and so those should just become part of our economic thinking, the way we factored in other economic constraints in past.
Fantastic, thank you, Judson. A general question. I'd like to invite anybody who wants to comment on this one. The current action plan is focusing a lot on sustainable investment, but what is the role for banks? Would anybody like to step in and comment?
Yeah, I guess I'm coming from banks, so maybe I should start that comment. Certainly there is work in train that will be directed towards the banks. I mean, the EBA has a number of mandates coming, not from the Sustainable Finance Action Plan specific regulations, things like the capital regulations, where essentially the EBA will be working on disclosure standards for banks. They'll be working on trying to define a supervisory process for banks. There's the ongoing work around climate scenario analyses and stress tests. So there is a large amount of work going on the prudential or the banking side, which in some sense mirrors to some degree what's going on the investment side. Perhaps can leverage some of the same concepts. There's work going on to think about applying the taxonomy to loans. There's some challenges in that, obviously, because a lot of loans don't have identified use of proceeds attached to them. But certainly your banks play a big role in this, and I think particularly in that transition finance area that we spoke a little bit about. I think one of the things that the banks really can support and work with is, given we have institutional relationships with large companies as they want to make their transitions. You look at, say, the announcements from BP early in the summer. That obviously reorients their business strategy. Reorients eventually their capital raising strategy. Reorients essentially the returns they're going to offer, and so house banks can be very much part of that equation, and essentially working with their clients as they rethink their overall strategies, and then that obviously then potentially drives financing approaches. So I think clearly a very, very large role there, and particularly in that transition space, which well, I think some thought probably needs to be given about do you want to put all the focus on the dark green when it comes to the discussion about banks, or do you have more of a discussion about sort of the messy gray middle and how to organize that transition, how to measure it, and how to track it.
Fantastic. Martin, we have 1 minute and 20 seconds left. Would you like to make a very brief comment in response to Judson? It doesn't seem like we can hear you, I'm afraid, at the moment.
To whom did you address your question? Sorry,
that was for you. If you wanted to make a very brief comment on the role of banks in the renewed sustainable finance strategy in 30 seconds or less, if that's possible, please.
Very good. Well, I think that banks have a particularly important role so far. We have been talking a lot about the green supporting sector and the brown penalizing sector. I think that we need to broaden the debate here beyond the prudential treatment, also to capture risk management and disclosure by the banking sector. And here we are very encouraged to see some very good initiatives in the markets, like the Principles for Responsible Banking. But we believe that in the review of the CRD/CRR, we will need to go further, especially to manage the risk side. So, I mean, this is a very important element that we would like to incorporate in the upcoming CRD/CRR to get inspiration from the work of the NGFS. It was 30
Brilliant.
seconds.
Thank you so much, Martin. And with that, I'd like to close the panel by thanking all of our participants, by thanking all of the audience for your interesting questions and for your attention. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the Global Roundtable. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.